dance time then, huh? So let justice roll down like mighty waters, like an ever-flowing stream. Why don't we have a prayer together and call it devotion, okay? Yeah, all right. Lord, we do give you grateful thanks, for you do call us to work with you in your great work of justice. It is not the only work. There are works of love and mercy. There are works of tender-hearted caring. There are works of compassion. But all of this is a part of your kingdom. Please inspire us to see where we can work for all of these things and justice as well, so that all your children can experience the goodness and the love that you have in store for them. In Christ's name, amen. Okay, Gail, you're...
Amen. We're going to come up to the present today, and we are really privileged and very happy that we have a true authority on this subject. Dr. Hawn Nelson is a product of CMS schools. I think I've got all this right. She began her career in the public school system here in Charlotte as a teacher and then administrator. And then Amy became the Director of Social Research for the UNCC Charlotte Urban Institute, and she was named the Charlottean, one of the Charlotteans of the Year in 2015 for her work in community engagement and educational equity. She's presently a member of the research faculty at the University of Pennsylvania in the area of policy analysis and social reform. I think that her experiences in the trenches in education here and her research that she's done on educational policy are going to give us a really unique perspective on the issues that are affecting educational equality. Thank you, Amy.
Good morning, everyone. It is a treat to be here. In all honesty, this is the topic that is kind of the love of my intellectual life, but I don't get to talk about it very much anymore, as much as I'd like to. I used to talk about it daily, and now I don't get to, so thank you for this treat. I also want to say thank you for the invitation. I grew up not too far from here off Cornwall Road, and I have not been this far south from Providence in a while. Wow. Like, I remember this campus from growing up, but wow. I clearly need to get out of my little East Charlotte bubble more, because you see the stats about 109 people move here a day, and you're like, where are they going? There are only so many condos in Noda and Plaza Midwood and Uptown that can be built, and now you come down here and you're like, this and the university, right? This is where they're going. All right, so you know what? I'm gonna get a timer because I don't trust myself with this topic on a Sunday morning without a full cup of coffee. All right. So I'm Amy Hawn Nelson, as Gail said, and Gail also is a close friend of my mother-in-law, who I call St. Carolyn, and I'm not being snarky. Like, the woman is a saint. I don't know what I would do without her, and the fact that they're good friends tells me a lot about Gail. So I'll say I'm partly here because of that. So thank you. So I do work for the University of Pennsylvania, research faculty there, and what I do mainly now is national in scope. My tiny little expertise in the world, besides educational equity in Mecklenburg County, is data sharing. A really fun topic, right? Cross-sector data sharing. So a lot of my life is super nerdy and technical, but it also revolves around these very large, overarching topics of trust, right? So we often say in our work that data travels at the speed of trust, because you have to trust in order to share, and before you can integrate data across sector, you have to share it. So I deal a lot, interestingly enough, in a professional capacity around this idea of trust, specifically social trust, because that's a lot of what cross-sector data sharing is. It is legal. In most cases, you have to do it carefully, but the real hurdle is trust. So I kind of obsess about this idea. So about a year or two ago, I created this presentation that kind of merged a bunch of my obsessions, have what you will. So that's kind of what this is. We are going to be in modern day for a lot, but I also go pretty deep in our history of North Carolina, because I think North Carolina, like every place, is the product of its history, and so we have to do a little bit of digging in the dirt to get what we're all growing within. So we're going to do a little bit of that too. I'm going to try to do all that within about 25 minutes, and that'll give us enough time for some discussion. Sound good? All right. I like PowerPoints. I go fast on slides, so sorry. I can make this available in after the presentation if that's helpful. But all right. Here I am. This is actually where my husband and I met at Beverly Woods Elementary School. We went to school together for 13 years and never had a conversation. That's another presentation, another story for another day. But this is me in kindergarten at Beverly Woods Elementary School, not too far away from here. And it's important for me to just start with this because I am very much a product of Charlotte Mecklenburg. My grandfather started Trinity Presbyterian a couple miles up the road. We drove past that and we said, "Hey, Papa's church," as we drove by. My other grandfather was the manager of a pawn shop gun dealer on Tryon Street. Those buildings long bulldozed. So when I say I'm Charlottean, I'm very Charlottean, and when I say that I care passionately about these topics, I care very deeply about these topics. They're very rooted into my very psyche and essence. And so this is one of those spaces where researchers like to talk about being, there are all kinds of terms around this, credible and independent and blah, blah, blah. I can't do that with this topic. It's too rooted too deeply. So what I can do is say I've had a lot of training that teaches me how to look at things very objectively. I'm very good at synthesizing information across a range of topics. So I've had a tremendous amount of training, and I also carry a lot of emotion about this topic. And in my world of community engaged research, I'm able to hold space for that I am both, I'm very knowledgeable about this topic, care deeply about it, and can present a lot of information around it that will hopefully make you think a little differently. So, this is why I stay in Charlotte. Frankly, this and St. Carolyn and my mother, who also lives here. These two darlings are in your with your child care right now. They were very excited about that roly-toly that's down there. They've never seen one of those before. So this is my community. This is the community where I choose to raise my children. I could relocate to Philly. I've chosen not to. And so I say all that with this as well. I am critical of our community, and it comes with a lot of love. That's another way to say that. So this is what I'd like us to focus on for about the next 20 minutes. And the book that you've been reading by Pam Grundy, who is just an incredibly talented historian, researcher, but also just a lovely writer. So hopefully you've really gotten to dive into her narrative around West Charlotte. And West Charlotte is really a story of how disparate groups of people could use a public policy to then grow and move and build community, or really a series of public policies. It just wasn't one, it was a lot of public policies that coalesced into the school community. And she does a really beautiful job of telling that. But I think it's also a story of social distrust, of bridging that where possible, and of acknowledging that, and in some places being able to go beyond it, and in some places her story is very clear that we haven't been able to go beyond the social distrust. So I just want to spend a little bit of time thinking about this. So how does social distrust impact our community, and what can we do to improve social distrust? I have thoughts about this that I'll share. So these are just headlines from the last 2 weeks. There's a lot of social distrust in our media. I don't probably need to go through in any group right now in 2019 United States, especially with the election season upon us, about the social distrust in media and the role in that. But I do think it's really important to note that we're at a different place in history around this. We don't trust our government. We've always had a group of people in our community that didn't trust our government. That's understandable, and that's part of our democracy. But we have large groups who don't trust our government. In fact, the majority of people in our community don't trust our government. And I think that is new and it's different, and I think we have to reckon with it a little bit. So there are, of course, broad disparities across political affiliation and trust. There's also very broad discrepancies in trust of by race and ethnicity that are, this is the air we all breathe. This is the ground that we're all tilling together right now. So when you look at all of these public opinion polls around government and you disaggregate them by race, you see something really dramatic, right? You see that people of color and white people can literally live in the same geography, in the same space, walk through the same sidewalks and roads and paths through the day, but really live in different worlds, both here and here. And so we have to ask, why is that, right? And this is something that's very hard for us to do. And I will just point out, as a white person doing this work, a lot of this work kind of lives in our body, and so you may notice during this presentation you find yourself being uncomfortable, or a lot of this is deep stuff. It's not intellectual. You feel it. So just acknowledge, like, wow, I feel this in my body right now. That's new, or that's different. So just, I think that's okay. Race, ethnicity, these topics are really tough. And especially, I think, with a Southern context, it makes it tougher. So just want to put that out there as well. All right, so I have more bad news for you. So here's our community. These are dot maps. So every dot you see here, and these are kind of old maps, but they're the same. Like the numbers haven't shifted, what I'm going to be talking about. They're census maps, so they're 9 years old now. They're based on 2010 census data. We're ramping up for a new census, which is in 2020. I'm sure y'all seen the news about that. There's lots of interesting stuff around census. That's another presentation. But this is old data, but it's still very relevant data. So every dot you see here is 10 people. And the blue that you see is represents white folks. And these are census identified categories. Black, red is Asian, and then orange is Hispanic. If we were to update this, you would see a lot more orange, because we are a Latino hypergrowth area, and so our Latinx population has dramatically expanded. So that's really the only dot that's off, but the rest are pretty valid. So with this map, you pretty much see this map over and over and over and over, no matter how you slice and dice the data. It says a very similar story. So this is, again, old data, but relevant. This is from the Quality of Life Explorer, which is a joint project between the Urban Institute at UNC Charlotte, Mecklenburg County, and City of Charlotte. And it is an effort to try to describe kind of changes. So there's, if any of you are data nerds, Google Quality of Life Explorer and block off an hour of your day, because you'll get lost. It's a lot of data, a lot of really beautiful visualizations, but also very scary visualizations. So these are all screenshotted from the real interface that you can get online. So if you want to explore, please do that. I find it fun. I don't know, but I know I'm not normal. Okay, so here's one map, and you see the same pattern over and over and over. Here's different variable, same map. This is, these are the representation of people who receive support for food and nutrition services from the government. Prenatal care, the darker colors are the folks that have more access to prenatal care. Water consumption, same map. Interestingly enough, the one map that is different is the power map, and that's because of kind of not great building practices and upkeep of our low-income areas. So actually the energy consumption is a very different map, but that's for different reasons. But water consumption, and then this is the one that I've made my career off of. This is the map that I think should and does keep a lot of us up at night. This is test proficiency for third graders. So what do these maps tell me? They tell me that it's not the children, right? When you have the same map that says the same thing, no matter how you dice it, it's not the children, y'all. It's not the teachers. Like, there's something else going on here that we have to reckon with. So a lot of my career has spent focusing on how do we reckon with this map, right? How do we prevent geography from being destiny for our kids? So lots of ways to think about this. Geography is destiny. There's, poverty rate is always important to keep in mind. Our poverty rate is significant. It has been, since the Great Recession, it's been trending down a little bit if you look at it at the whole. But the problem is it's not trending down if you disaggregate it. So if you just look at a number by itself, it says one thing, but once you split it into categories, it says something very different. So we see that our poverty rate is really not changing that much. And in fact, in some instances, it is going up. So overall trend of poverty is going down. Certain subgroups, particularly for Black families and families of color, it is going up. All right, so this is a place where this computer does not, I should have PDF'd this presentation, is what this slide tells me. We're gonna go on. That just says this, if you had this in a PDF, it would just say this orange line are Latinos. It's just the growth is explosive and it looks really different from the growth of everything else. But I'll PDF it for you, I'll get a copy of it later. All right, so here we go back to this other important, the changing demographics. And we do see that there are shifts. More and more folks are identifying as race and ethnicity as being racism as a problem. So that's a bright spot, I would say. But of course, still we have more to do, especially in order to move forward on social distrust. So here's some good news. I should have put, I actually made this slide a while ago, and it's before Pam's book was published. But the good news is that there is a lot of both literature, so nonfiction and fiction, but particularly the fiction around these topics that are new, just the amount of work being done on this is pretty prolific. And so it is hard for people to say that they don't know or they don't have resources. 15, 20 years ago, you could kind of muck about in these topics and really not have good places where these concepts are clearly communicated, but that is not the case now. We have all of this scholarship that is new and that is really wonderfully done and very readable. So I would encourage you, if these books are new to you, I would encourage you to take a look. And I'm sure, of course, the one that you're reading, and I'm sure that out of that book club will come other opportunities for reading. So I'm going to go a little personal here in the next, more personal than the next others. So this is, has anyone ever looked at this map before? This is a publicly available tool. It is literally the maps that came out from the federal government in the 1930s and 40s for redlining. I'm hoping everyone's familiar with the concept of redlining. It was a federal policy that was really a banking policy that became a housing policy. Essentially the idea was that the federal government didn't want to back loans that wouldn't be repaid. So how did they manage that risk? They create maps of communities where they identify folks who are likely to default on loans. Who's more likely to default on loans? People that are living in Jim Crow America, right? People who aren't considered full citizens, don't have full rights, aren't able to make a living, right? So who is going to default on loans? It is the folks of color. So redlining maps were made. They were federal housing policy really up until the 70s. They weren't totally taken out root and branch until the 70s. So these maps are now publicly available. This arrow that you see here, that is my house that I live in right now. And I put this on here because it's really relevant to my day-to-day. I've lived in my house for 12 years. I raised my lovely, beautiful children there. I love our neighbors. But our street, here I am, a researcher that does a lot around race and social trust and issues of equity and justice. And I live on a street that is almost completely white. Even though I live in an area of town that is incredibly racially diverse. And I never really understood that. Because when we first moved on our street back in 2007, it was diverse because there was a lot of rental units. There were a lot of people who owned houses who didn't live in them. And they were renting them out, and they were, it was East Charlotte 12 years ago, so it's a little different than it is now. And it was, and a situation where we did have a lot of diversity when we first bought the house and when we first moved in, and now there's literally not a single person of color except for one person of Indian descent on our entire street. And a lot of that is because the people that own the houses have moved back in, or they've gone to family members as people have passed away, because our area was redlined. We have covenants in our deed restrictions from the 1940s saying that only people who are white can own and live in these houses. And so this is particularly relevant because the house across the street from me, the owner of that, who was just a lovely human being, he passed away a couple months ago. He was the original owner. He moved into that house when he was 2 years old. It was built in 41. We have a couple of those. I have 3 neighbors who are original owners or immediate family members of original owners. So we can't talk about this housing policy from the 30s and 40s and say that it's ancient history, right? This housing policy from the 30s and 40s impacts my day-to-day and my children's day-to-day, and frankly, the neighborhood schools of my community every day, right? So I think it's really important for us to say this isn't ancient history. This is still very current, relevant, and it has to be talked about. The legacy of this has to be talked about. Here's me again. So this house is also relevant. This is a house that was my grandmother's house. I'm in the middle with the tongue, 4 kids. This is like my personality wrapped up in a picture. So this is my family sitting at my grandmother's house a couple of months before she sold it. My grandfather passed away, the one that was the manager of the pawn shop, Charlottean. She remarried, moved to Florida, did that life that everyone wants, right? So she sold this house right off Providence Road, but off of Crescent Avenue. For any of you who know, old school Providence, kind of near, right near the hospital, right in the heart of Myers Park. So she sold that house in the 80s, and that was generational wealth that was created from that house. They bought that house in the 50s, sold in the 80s. They made a tremendous amount of money off of that. That money was dispersed between my dad, my uncle, my aunt, and all of our cousins. In fact, 2 of my cousins had their entire college careers paid for with that money. They won't acknowledge that, but that's where that money came from. And we still continue to have generational, this is 20-year-old, 30-year-old stuff, and we still have generational wealth that was built off of the selling of this house so my house was in an area that was right on the edge. I actually wasn't in green. Her house is right in that green chunk. It's right in the center of that green chunk. So her area was the most sought after area to own a house in at this time, because it pretty much said no one will default on these loans, and so it is a very secure investment. So you were able to get a much lower interest rate, much more favorable loan, etc. I don't need to explain all that to y'all. All right, so continuing this kind of reckoning, right? So I've had to do a lot of personal reckoning with my own family history and the generational wealth that we have received as white folks in Charlotte from federal housing policy. But I'm going to go into a little bit deeper, Queen, here as we talk about more education policy and how all of this kind of works together. So this is Charles B. Aycock. Anyone recognize that name from your history books? Anyone? Good. You'll see why I say that in a minute. All right. Sorry, I'm totally off notes right now. I'm trying to get back on. Okay, so this is Charles Aycock. If you look at anything of his in a textbook, he's referred to as the education governor. He was the governor of North Carolina from 1901 to 1905. According to textbooks like this one, he led an ambitious program of education reform to improve segregated black schools and to promote black achievement and advancement. So under his leadership, school funding and literacy rates supposedly dramatically improved, at least for some North Carolinians, and I'll come back to that. Yet through personal records, we have a lot of journals, a lot of letters, a lot of personal parts of his communication that have been saved painstakingly by researchers like Pamela Grundy. And we know that he was a staunch white supremacist. In fact, the history that I learned with Aycock and the history that really is completely revisionist history. And I would argue that this sort of revisionist history and this sort of lack of reckoning creates a tremendous amount of social distrust. So here we go to a picture of the only successful coup in American history was in our state. Does anyone know of this story? Wilmington, great. Sometimes referred to as the Wilmington riots or the Wilmington massacre of 1898. It was the end of Reconstruction. Federal government had declined to keep federal troops in to support Reconstruction efforts. At the time, North Carolina politics was led by this group called the Fusion Movement. It was a really interesting political group of black, whites, a lot of diversity within the political group. It was very progressive, of course. So they came into power, and the Fusion Party had amassed quite a bit of power and influence. And as you can imagine, some people didn't like that. So 2 days after a Fusion Party mayor and city council was elected in Wilmington, a group of 2,000 men attacked and burned down the only black-led newspaper in North Carolina, pictured here. They murdered, we don't even know true numbers, we think it's around 60 people. They destroyed all black-owned businesses and homes, drove an estimated 2,000 people out of Wilmington, 2,000 black people out of the city permanently, never to return. They abandoned jobs, property that they owned, homes that they owned, communities, you know. They literally killed or ran out the democratically elected officials out of town and took over the government. And as you can see, there's no shame here for these men. This is historical record. Here's a picture, right, of these men. They're not hiding, right? They're not in hoods. There's no hiding what they did here. So the crazy thing is that Charles Aycock, through his personal correspondence, is seen to have been the mastermind behind this. At the time, the population of Wilmington was only 20,000 people. So getting 2,000 people involved in anything was quite an undertaking, right? That's a significant percentage of any population at this time. So this wasn't a mob. This was like a carefully organized, constructed, situation. So it was a planned insurrection. I think some historians would go as far as saying. So Aycock wasn't in Wilmington that day. Probably knew better for that, but the historical record shows very clearly that he supported the activities that led to this, and certainly knew about it. So, and then he rode this wave to become governor. So this also is all related to gerrymandering. People think of it as a recent tool. It's not a recent tool. It's been used for over 100 years. So these are maps from the 1870s, and you can see that. Aycock didn't like the redrawing of maps because he was a white man living in District 2, and District 2 was made to be a black district, just like we have black districts now. And so he didn't like that. Of course, he didn't like the way the maps were drawn. So he had aspirations to become governor, so how do you do that? A lot of work, but one of the ways that they did it was to suppress voter rights, specifically targeting black men, because if he could control black men and suppress voting rights of black men in his district, then therefore he could be electable to governor, frankly, without even having to move to another district like a lot of our politicians have to do now. So the context here is that at the time, black men had an extraordinarily high voting rate. The historical record shows that in 1884, 98% of black men voted in North Carolina. Like, just to give you some context, anyone have a guess of like our last local primary? It's like 8%. So they have 98% of black men voting. Like, that is unbelievable. Like, we don't even get to like 30-40% here in Mecklenburg County for a major election. So how do you consolidate power in the 1800s, late 1800s? You break apart a voting block. So they did that multiple ways, lots of voter suppression tools. Again, none of these are new. A lot of these are being resurrected currently or have been resurrected currently. And there you have voting rates of black men. Within just a few years, they go to 0%. So in this case, literacy test was the main way that they did this, and then of course just terror. This was the reign of terror was when this all started. But in this case, literacy was used as a tool for voter suppression very effectively. And so I bring this up because it's not ancient history. Here we are. It's same playbook. just kind of different flavors of it. Social distrust, right? Like not reckoning this, not knowing history, the textbook's not telling us history. I didn't learn any of this in school, none of it. I didn't even learn this at NC State, where I did an Africana Studies degree. I have a degree in sociology and Africana Studies, and I didn't learn this even in college. So there is a tremendous amount of distrust, and I always argue that it's a very valid distrust from our lack of reckoning. So I would argue that the main way we can reckon is to do exactly what you all have been doing. You have been digging deep in a very difficult book to read. The first part of Pam Brenner's book is just lovely, and then the second part, you kind of need to take a walk, in the middle of every chapter because it's hard to read. So I think doing this work that you've been doing and digging into this content is really important. Doing this reckoning is important, and I would argue that that's the only way that we're going to breed more trust in our community to bridge the policies and the histories that we don't always connect together. So thank you. Hope everyone had coffee this morning. I know that's not light stuff, so. Yeah, question?
Yes, we're open for questions,
Yeah.
discussion.
I think that, I agree that trust is something that is very much important to any group of people. It's very difficult the larger the groups get, but the success of a group and the ability to work together is based on that as much more than an agreement on policy. On the other hand, we can be educated to guilt, which we are, by programs such as this. We might even educate other people to facts that produce guilt. But I don't know how we spread trust, particularly, and that's in a general term, no matter what the situation is. It's particularly difficult when I think that there are forces existing that intentionally are attempting to create as much distrust as they can.
I agree.
So trust, I think, is important. Guilt is something we can learn about. And how do we foster trust?
I'm glad you brought up the word guilt. It's interesting. That's one I've reckoned with a lot. That's been a lot of my own reckoning. And it's interesting. I don't have guilt around this anymore. I think I did for a really long time. So I'm going to sit with that. I think that's an interesting thing to think about. I think there's a way that we can talk about this in a way that is empowering. And we can kind of push through those feelings, because this isn't, I mean, it is personal, right? Everything we're talking about, I'm one that firmly thinks the personal is political, right? To harken back to that 60s button. But I think there is a place where we can say, like, I didn't make those federal policies, within HUD back in the 40s. My grandmother didn't. My father didn't choose to go to a brand new facility at Myers Park High School as the second graduating class. It was a completely segregated white facility, and he had an excellent education. Like he didn't, he didn't seek it. I think so. Guilt is a really, I think, important concept for us to think about, and there's a reckoning there as well. So I think that for me that deserves more thought. So thank you for that. I do wholeheartedly agree that we're in really challenging environment where we are bombarded and inundated with a media diet that just, as my grandmother would say, stirs the pot for ratings, right? And I think we can make very personal decisions to shift that. I myself am very careful about my news diet. I'll be honest, my children don't know the name of a single elected politician. Very purposefully. I want them to grow up in a household that values democracy and democratic ideals. They know a lot about voting. They know a lot about talking to city council members. They know a lot about local government because they can see that person. My daughter regularly makes cookies with our school board representative because that's, probably my most important people that I talk to. My daughter probably knows most of our school board by name, some nicknames. But I am very careful about that for her. I'm also very careful about news we have on. We don't even listen to NPR on the radio anymore with them in the room. And I am very careful about what I read. I'm very careful about sources, but I've also had a lot of training about sources. I'm hoping that when Pam, is she coming next week? I would really encourage y'all to talk to Pam about how she discerns sources. I've actually had Pam come to me a few times and be like, don't use that source. Historians are excellent at that, and I think that's a learning that we can all take from that training that I've taken a lot from. So I think in thinking about how we cannot be a part of that is to get information person to person, trusted connectors, to be a part of a community, right? To not live our lives virtually, and to do things like this, right? To be a part of a community that you're with every week. Breaking bread and thinking about large ideas like justice and love, while also learning together. I think that's the magic sauce. I think you're doing it. Yeah, I'm sorry, I saw her hand first, and then
I was just, when Ron mentioned that about guilt and distrust, I was struck by the statistic that you showed early on that most white people don't acknowledge the privilege that they've had from being white. And I think that is tied up with not wanting to feel guilty, perhaps.
Maybe, I don't know. I think it's paralyzing as part of it. We sometimes partition things off just to get through the day. And I think that's part of it. I think it's a lot of work to reckon with this stuff, right? It's you feel in your body, you feel in your head, you feel in your relationships. I have a couple of family members that they really don't like my research. It is tough. It's tough for relationships. I think a lot of it is just the world is hard, and it's just one more thing. I don't judge people at all for not having the energy and space to not really sit with tough stuff at times. But I do think we do have to reckon with it eventually, because we are paying the piper right now. I would argue for not reckoning. Yeah.
I think though that we have a tremendous responsibility. Most of us are grandparents or great-grandparents, and the dialogue that we have with those children. I know just talking back and forth, we went to an exhibit at the Black Center down there. I had one grandson with me, and
Were you at Harvey Gantt, the Harvey Gantt Museum?
Harvey Gantt,
Okay.
and they had an exhibit, I think, about hanging or whatever. And this grandson was in his black period, and he had dark clothes on and so on and so forth. And so we were staring at this, and I think from looking at his face at the time, this was a surprise to him. But while we were there, there was a black boy that came in, and he took one look at my grandson and he backed off. And my grandson, well, what was that all about? And I said, let's do a little talking about this. And it was an opportunity to get him to start thinking about where he was. And I think that's a big responsibility that we have. We can't do an awful lot now ourselves because we're out of a generation that has a lot of influence, but we do have influence for the ones coming up.
I would disagree with that statement. Some of the most effective community organizers that I work with today are of the generation you just described. They have grandparents and great-grandparents. Because I think there are a couple of reasons for this. One, they don't care. Because you can say stuff that I can't say. At least my mom really doesn't care. Like, Mom, you really need to, just a little bit, just a little bit, rein it in a little bit. But the organizers and just the community supporters, right, that I think it's very valuable. I think there's also a lot of trust, because it's very hard to trust someone. Like, when I meet someone running for office here that's lived in this town 2 years, I'm kind of like, you can't figure out this town in 2 years. You just can't. So you have, a lot of you who've lived here for enough time where when you say something about the state of our community, you're not talking in a short data set. You have an expansive data set that is of value And I would argue that we should be listening more, rather than to the people that have been here 2 years that think they've got it figured out.
But to Lynn's point, I take my grandchildren, to heart, and anything that I say or do really is with them in mind, and their children. But I also hear people say, I've got mine, it's maybe not so many words to them. I've got mine, I'm going to enjoy what I have, what I've worked hard for, I'm going to enjoy it now, and, move to heck with the future. I think that is an attitude that a lot of people in this area have, is like, I've worked hard, and anything that I have is because I deserved it, and they aren't even thinking about their own grandchildren. It's like they don't really see 20, 30, 50 years from now that our children and our grandchildren are going to be suffering for these policies.
I think there's a little bit of that in every group, but I will say the place I do see a bright spot and a lot of hope is the generation below me. So I was born in '79. I'm technically an exennial if you're into that stuff. Cool, right? So I had an analog childhood but a digital early adulthood. So I didn't have email. Yeah, I didn't have email until college, which is fun. My brain is, I can tell you from working with people just a couple years younger than me that had internet in elementary and middle school, my brain is different. So I grew up, differently, but I will say that the generations right below me, they don't, I think there's a shift coming with that generation. I work with a lot of people in their early 20s and mid-20s, and I've had the honor of mentoring a lot of people through their careers, and I think it's changing. I think my generation, I think what you're seeing is characteristic of us that grew up in the 80s and 90s, these boom areas, these boom periods with a lot of stability, and but the generation below has not grown up with that, and I think they're different, and I see a lot of hope there. Yeah.
Do you work with reparation in terms of trust, and do you think that would foster trust? It just feels odd to me that coming from growing up in Greensboro, KKK, and thinking maybe we had gotten enlightened and moved beyond that phase, to feeling like it's coming back, and the politicians are wanting to talk about reparation. It's like, how are
There's a
you
disconnect.
ever going to meet?
I hear you. Yes, I am intellectually intrigued with the idea of reparations, but it is like many things where I don't see what it would look like. And then, so there's some people who think about it as like in Alaska. Alaska has essentially like a check that every Alaskan gets annually that they receive as being a resident of Alaska. It's essentially like collectively pooled oil revenues. So some people have described reparations as something like that, where you would just have a collective pool, everyone gets a check. It's like a, just a pot of money. I think that's one way to think about it. But I don't know if any of you have been following the politics in Alaska right now. They have a new governor that just came to power, and they have, one of the campaign promises was to increase those checks. And so they have cut funding to the university system by 47%. So they have literally eliminated their public education and post-secondary system in order to fulfill a campaign promise to increase those checks. So when people talk about reparations, my mind goes there where I'm like, that may work for like a year. That may happen, but we live in a democracy, things are always shifting. What is to keep that in place? So that's the place where I'm in
opportunity attached to it.
I'm intrigued with the idea. I don't know how it would play out, and I don't think we've been thinking about it. But I agree, it's an intriguing idea. There's, if anyone is interested in a really compelling, interesting, mind-bending take on this, Ta-Nehisi Coates has written on this for The Atlantic. It's called The Case for Reparations. I would encourage you to, it is not beach reading, but I'd encourage you to pour a strong cup of coffee or a large glass of wine and sit down with it and wrestle with it. It's a lot, yeah, but great topic, thank you.
I grew up in Florida, taught school in Levy County for a couple of years, and I think that's where, I think it's Rosewood, where there was a massacre early in the 20th century. And the legislature there, which is interesting, they did come up with a policy of reparations. And I'm wondering if anything like that has been discussed in North Carolina concerning Wilmington.
Thank you for bringing that up. I was just recently reading about that because that's one that I knew happened, but I didn't know the community has done a lot of work around it. And Rosewood was a very small community, so that's how it is different. It was like a small hamlet, essentially.
It doesn't exist anymore.
Yeah, it's gone, but it was this like tiny, versus Wilmington is this large metropolis, and it was thousands of people affected by this. So I think that's one big difference. But yeah, no, nothing. In fact, so my sister-in-law lives in Wilmington. We're down there a lot. We're down there probably 3 weeks a year. And I mean, people love me at parties. I ask people who are educated there, like, did you know this happened? So far, I've never had a single person say they know about it. It is not part of the history there. I have a very close friend. We went to Hopkins together, taught in Baltimore City schools together. She has a lot of consciousness around these topics and is, likes history, reads a lot of history. She has a PhD in English, like you know, reads a lot, a couple books a week. She's lived there for 15 years. Asked her over beer years ago, like, have you ever heard of this? Never heard of it. So it is not talked about at all. There's been no reckoning, I would argue.
Just since it goes along this not talked about, we grew up in California. You'd think, oh, they have wonderful stuff. Well, not so necessarily. My wife was raised in Costa Rica, so she didn't speak English when they came back to the United States. She was 5'2", eyes of blue, 100%. But people would reject her to play with their children because she was a lesbian. At the same time, as we went to high school, we had one black student in the entire school, and he maintained that he was really a Hawaiian. Found out later that there used to be notices in our downtown area, this beautiful little community, that said, black man don't let the sun set.
Sundowning laws.
Yeah. And it wasn't the sundown law, but it was a supported wing of the culture. But having grown up there, I had never heard of it until I started asking myself, why do we only have one black guy in high school?
So for those of you not familiar with sundowning law, so these were laws in some places, Washington State, Oregon, a lot of the Pacific Northwest. This was one of their special brands of racism and isolation, but they were laws that said after 5 o'clock, whatever can be here. And a lot of them were on law, like were statute, and then there were a lot of other communities that were informal and just enforced these social mores.
I want to say a positive thing. But as someone that has lived as old as I am, I grew up in the South in segregated schools, and as I had children, things changed. I've seen the Ku Klux Klan, I've been to the Selma March, and I just want to say, you can change. You don't have to stay back in those times and those thinkings, which I think people today want to keep those things that they grew up with. I don't. I love to see the youth today. I love hearing your challenge. You're looking into all the different angles of housing, schooling, and so forth. So when you're my age, you got to change. So get on it.
That's a great
closer.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Amy. I did want to remind you that, thank you. I don't know if you're into cooking, but it's got pretty pictures in it.
I love to eat other people's cookies. But I'm
Give it to Carol.
No, I can learn from it. I'm just not a great cook. Proficiency thing.
Well, we really appreciate, this was very different from what we've been hearing I know numbers can lie, but it's good to see, it's good to see things in that, from this perspective.
And if anyone's interested, this is the book that, it's from 2015, so it kind of predates the color and character. That is very readable, I'll be honest. This is more of like an academic light version of that with different context, but if anyone's interested, this is our book. I think it's sold at the Levine Museum and then of course at Harvard Books, Amazon, but warning, not a beach read. But if you want to get the weeds on this, there are some good like prescriptive chapters of where we think we should go with policy. And then actually a lot of things that we prescribed were steps taken during the reassignment discussions of 2016. So. Great, thank you.
Next week is Pamela Grundy. The last week is just us, and hopefully we're gonna, we've really been educated, we've really learned a lot, and from there I hope we're gonna find ways we can use what we've learned to be the hands and ears, all of it. If anybody needs a copy, this is an extra copy of the book if anybody's interested.